Alright, in this video we're going to look into the vegetation area of our terrain. So we're going to go over to our roll-up bar, to our terrain tab, and down here we'll see vegetation. We're going to highlight that and pop it open. Now you can play around with the different settings under here once you have some stuff created, but the two we're going to deal with are creating a vegetation category and creating a vegetation object. So the first thing we're going to do is create a category. Let's call this one woods. So now we have that created over here. We're going to highlight that and we're going to click Add Vegetation Object. That's going to bring up our previewer for our various things, and we'll get all the way back out of here. And you have all sorts of different stuff in here that you can play with. There's a very large vegetation system here. We're going to go to Natural, and we're going to pick a few different objects. We're going to go to Ground Plants and Grass. And Big Patch Medium should do nicely. So we will open that. And then we're going to create another vegetation object. And let's see, we want bushes, cliff bush, yellow mini should be nice. Yep, we like that. And then last but not least, let's get some trees in our woods. So we will go to Natural, Trees, River Tree, and River Tree B is a nice little one. Alright, so now we have all of these in here. And if we click on the whole category, we get this overall setting for all these different things that we can use to change up how everything lays down on there. It's the same box you get if you pick them individually, pretty much. Now, there's a few of these that I do want to go over and talk about. The first being size. Size of 1 means basically it is the size that the artist originally created it at. So we can adjust that depending on what we're doing in our game to get a different size variance. We have a small island, so I'm going to bring this down a little bit. We're not going to have a lot of big trees on it. We'll say 0.8. So 80% of what they originally set it at. The second one is size variation. Now this is an amount of variation from the size that it can differ between. You don't want to go really hog wild with this, especially with something like trees. You could go push it a little further with bushes and stuff, but generally you don't want to go too far. We're going to put in a variance of 0.2. So basically now we will be going from 0.6 or 60% of the original size up to the original size, since we have 0.8 in here. Now the next one is random rotation. That'll default to false. We want that to be true because we want them to rotate on their own. The second one you will sometimes use is align to terrain. You're generally not going to use it for most things. Align to terrain is going to make your plant stick straight out from whatever the surface of your terrain is. So if you have a tree over here, it's going to stick out at this weird angle. Now depending on what you're doing, you might want that, and it can be very good on cliffs for very small plants that you want to look like they're growing out the side of that. But most of the time, regardless of how the terrain's flowing, you're going to want things to grow straight up. So we will not be using that. You can also use the use terrain color. I tend not to because it really does some pretty radical effects to the diffuse colors of your vegetation. It bases them off of the terrain that they're placed on. But you can play around with it a little bit and see. Bending is set at 1 by default, and that's a pretty good bend. You would want to increase that if you were doing a scene with very high storm winds or something like that. But generally 1's going to be pretty good. We will get into this later, but down here you'll see grow on voxels and grow on brushes. Now later when we create some voxel terrain, a good way to make that look a little more natural where it's at is to get some vegetation in there. And by default, it won't let you do that. Now you would think that you would check grow on voxels to true. But guess what? When you go back to paint, that's still not going to work. However, if you check grow on brushes to true, you will be able to paint on that voxel terrain. Now, I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know if that's something that's changed with different revisions. My guess would be is that voxel terrain is very similar to a CSG brush type entity, so that's why grow on brushes works, but that's just a guess on my part. We'll leave that on true just for later. After that, we're going to drop down to brightness. Now, brightness, a setting of 1 is basically all of your diffuse colors are at what the artist originally intended them to be at. If you want to really brighten things up for a particularly sunny day, you can take this up a little bit, 1.2, 1.3. If you want it to be very kind of dark and creepy, you can bring that down a little bit. Now mind you, 1 is what the artist originally wanted. 0, the entire model will look completely black. So again, generally it's something you can play around with for a little bit of effect. But you don't want to get wild here, and most of the time you probably won't change it, but you should know it's there. Next is density. Now, density is one where it just doesn't work like your intuition would tell you. Now, if you are painting a large area and it's painting in a bunch of trees and you only want a few trees, you would think, well, I'll lower my density. No, what you're going to do is really raise your density. This number is essentially how many units each instance can be away from each other. So if you have a density of 1, then every 1 unit it can place a tree or a bush or whatever, and the units are the units size that the individual piece takes up. So if you want to spread your trees out, then you're going to take your density up to, like a 3 or maybe 4 or something like that. So that's just to bear in mind, because that's very counterintuitive, at least to me. So that's one I always have to think about when I'm playing around with it. The last few we're going to look at, one is the elevation min-max and the slope min-max. Now, this works exactly like our settings did when we were painting our terrain, and you can use that to only paint in specific areas. If you only want wood where your grass was, well, then we can go back and we can look at our grass. And we can see that we had an altitude of 20 on up and a slope of only up to 30 degrees. So if we go back in here and we look at what we've created here, we can take this and we can set that slope max to 30, and we can set that elevation minimum to the 20 that we had it at. And now it's only going to paint in these areas where we did this grass. So that's very handy for us. It's a great way to be able to paint that stuff in much quicker. Last but not least is cast shadows and receive shadows. Generally, I'm going to operate with cast shadows on, at least on my trees. On a small area like this, I would probably tend to do it on all of them. And I will often go in individually and change each one of these just to be sure that I'm setting stuff the way I want. So we will change that. Although you can see the changes we made globally to the group did apply. So that's just kind of a hinky thing with me to do it that way. So we'll set those both to true. And that'll get us ready to paint on our terrain. Alright, so we're going to come over here We're going to come up to here, and you have a brush radius, which you can either type in a number or control from here. And for that brush to become active, you have to have paint objects clicked. Now anything that's ready to paint will be lit up in red. You can paint individual objects, and you can place an individual instance. Just lower your brush down very far and place a single instance. Or you can choose the whole category, raise your brush up, and paint a great many instances of each object. Now as you see, this is pretty heavy woods. So let's go in and take a look at some of these settings that we've got going on here. We'll back this out a little bit by Control-Z-ing our way out of this. And let's go in and let's look at some of the settings we have for this stuff. So our big patch is at 0.8 and 0.2 random, that's all fine. So we're going to go into our density. Let's make that 3. And we don't want quite as many of the great big bushes. Let's make that 5. And lastly, on our trees, let's make that 3. Now, when we paint the whole thing, let's see what we get this time. A little more control going on there. It's still pretty thick, and that's okay for right now. We'll just see what we've got going on. Adding these in. And maybe we'll go up here and add in a little bit. Put some up here. Yeah, I'm not sure I like that up there. Let's not do that. Maybe over here we could have a little bit. Now, once you've got all that painted, and maybe it's a little too heavy, or maybe you just want to create a path or something like that, you can delete vegetation by holding down Control and clicking. Now there's a couple things to note when we do this. Generally I bring my brush size down a little bit, but we don't want to bring it down a ton. Here's why. When we originally placed this, with that brush size, it covered a certain area, but the add and remove function is based off the center of that area. So if you want to remove it, you've got to be placed over that center when you do it. And that can get a little tricky, especially if you're working on really low numbers. So it's often better to work pretty close, at least, or I would say not less than half of the density or the size of the brush that you had to begin with. But we can come in, we can get rid of a little bit of this. And as you can see, we can start to get rid of bits and pieces that we don't want. I can bring that brush size down a little bit and just get rid of, see if we can just get rid of some of the plants. But you can see it's getting a little trickier to find some of that. It can be done, and you may want to do it. Yeah, I ended up getting rid of that tree anyway. That's fine. Now, that brings up a couple other things we want to look at, and that's placing things individually. And by the way, if my area brush here looks different than yours because of this blue thing. It's because of that grow on brushes. If you take rid of that, get rid of that, take rid of that. If you get rid of that, you'll have just the green brush there for your placement. So if it does look a little different, don't worry about it, that's why. I've just already got it on because we're going to play with that later. Now, maybe you want to put some things, like you want to put a specific tree. So we're going to bring our radius down, and you may have to play with it a little bit. Yep, oh there we go. Because sometimes when it's really small, it needs a certain size just to function. So we've got that going there, that looks pretty good. That tree there, that looks pretty good. And we can come back over here, bring our brush back up, pick our whole thing again, and well, we'll place some stuff around here. And we'll go back and maybe we'll do cliff bush. And we'll bring our radius way down. And maybe we'd like one here. See, it's trying to figure out against that angle that we're allowing it. Oh, that's way too much. Yep, I don't like that, so we're just not going to bother with that. We may go back in. You can go back in and find some other smaller brushes, maybe some ferns or some grass or something like that to put in there and play with. We can play over here. Maybe put in a little. Maybe we'll put in a tree or two. There we go. We got some trees growing there. I don't like all of those. Let's get rid of one at least, just because they're rotating nicely, but the height variation is not massive. So, and again, I don't think I like these up here. So we're gonna bring up the size of that brush. Oh, let's see, I've just got a tree, so now we can leave our bushes. And that brings up another thing. You can add and remove even within these objects just by picking. So since I only had river tree selected, that's all it got rid of on here, and that works fine for this situation. And likewise, since ocean winds would probably not let trees grow very well on these high elevations, we can take these two and we can paint in a little bit. Bring our brush down. There we go. Looking pretty cool. We're in pretty good shape here. All right. Now, there's one last thing that I do want to discuss. On a map this small, we're not going to tend to use it very much. But we need to talk about something called X trees. So let's take a look at adding another vegetation category. Let's call this one X trees. And let's add this object. Go back to our natural. I think it's under trees here. Yeah, X trees. And we have a series of pine trees basically. Now, something to note is at the end of this you're going to see 10 or 20. That's how many you're going to get in a group when you click once. So you can get quite a few going. We'll take this X trees small 10 and we'll do that. Now I'm not going to keep these again because it's a very small map, and what X trees are meant to be is kind of exactly what they're called. They're two planes in an X. Well, I think in the case of this they're actually three in a six-sided shape. See if it'll let me place them. Let's see what we have. May not have enough area. Change our elevation down just in case that's messing with us. And then we'll bring our brush size up. And there we go. Now, that looks like heck right there. And that's basically because we're so close to these. But you can see as you back off, where if you have an area, mountainous area on the map that the player can't get to, or places in the distance that the player can't get to from where they're at, this is a very low memory way to add a lot of vegetation to what you're doing. So they are very useful. Play with those some if you're making a somewhat bigger map or you have another test map, which I highly recommend. And just see what those look like when you get them done, and play around with some of the size variations and things like that, the brightness, and see what you get, and just get used to those. But again, we are not going to use them on this just because this map is so small. So we have our X tree saying, now we really don't need this. So we can go in and either remove vegetation object. I don't remember if there's a get rid of category or not. I don't think there is. Yeah, that would just be individual. But you can right click and remove it. Do we want to delete it? Yes, because we're not going to use that. Now, while we're right clicking, let's look at a couple of things in here. Perhaps you've already painted a bunch of stuff and you don't want to go in and scroll through all this for just a couple of things. So let's look at a couple of the things that we have in this category. Okay, we can add a new category, we can rename it, we can replace one object with another, we can remove an object from the group, add objects, clone objects. But the couple I really want you to notice are randomly rotate all instances, and you'll see how that changed that. And scale selected instances. These are still looking pretty big, so we're going to take this down 0.7. Now that starts to look a little bit better. Now we get in here and let's game test this. Control G. Oh, and then I threw a grenade. That was fun. Alright. So there, that tree height's not too bad. So we'll get out of there. I'm pretty happy with that. But it did really lighten this up a lot. So if you do that and you're thinking this is looking a little bit sparse, you can either go in and individually add some stuff where you want, or you can do something like we've got our category here. What if we wanted to add another object? What if we didn't want this object to be grass or a tree? Well, just because it's vegetation doesn't mean that you can't do rocks. So what if we looked at forest rocks? And no. Yeah, how about forest ground sea? And we can go ahead and pick this. We've got our brush radius. We'll bring that down a little bit. And we'll just have a look over here. See what that looks like when we place some stuff. You can see we're getting little bits of rock here and there. That's quite a bit of rock. Let's bring this brush down a lot further. I don't like that placement. What if we, it may be a little over there. Maybe a little over here. Now this you really got to watch because you can't always see them getting placed, and you can end up with a lot more than you intended to. But you can also go in, maybe we're going to add another one. And a medium rock here. Let's see what that looks like. Now I haven't played with these, so now we're just playing around a little bit. Let's bring that size down. Let's make that 0.7. Give it a size variation of 0.5, quite a bit. And let's see what we oh, those are pretty small. I was expecting that to be something else. So let's replace it. Let's try that Rock Forest B. Let's see what we get with that. And this is what I'm talking about just, oops. Let's not have our tree selected. Ooh, that's a massive one. That'll do nicely if we play with it a little bit. Let's really bring that size down. Let's see what this does for us. Oh, that's pretty good. There. See, yeah, that's pretty cool. I like that. So you see, you can flesh out these pretty quick. Get some pretty neat looking stuff going. Well, certainly in level creation, this is something that you want to spend quite a bit of time with. Get that to look good. That I don't like. Let's take that back up to very little variation. See what we get here. Yeah, a little weird. Maybe we'll take our radius down. Get individual rocks. Yeah, it works a little better. Maybe we'll get a big one here or there. Anyway, there you go. You can see you get a lot of variation with just a few setting changes to get some stuff going on. Now, by all means, before the next lesson, take some time, paint in some small areas, maybe add some little cliff vegetation around here. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next lesson. But you guys, by all means, play. You can even, if you want to challenge, without me showing you anything, you can play around with maybe placing some underwater vegetation. Look around in there, find that. Mind you about your elevations and things like that if you want to paint on those. But maybe just for fun, for a challenge, give that a try. And other than that, we'll see you in the next lesson.